There's an age-old question about whether ASL is derived from LSF, and etymological studies have shown that etymology can actually help us find where various signs come from. And in fact, we have found that many of those American Sign Language signs indeed came from Old French Sign Language, LSF. I'd like to explain a little bit more now about what etymology is. Etymology looks back to the first instances of a certain word from a language and sees how that word evolved from language to language. Etymology likes to look back at all the different reiterations of this word in various languages and usages. Sometimes we see that usage changes. Sometimes when there's contact between two languages, a word is borrowed and the meaning is changed. And so that's etymology. There's actually quite a bit of folk etymology in ASL, deaf Americans passing on information from one generation to another, but we do have to distinguish between that and pure scientific etymology. Somebody might say, oh, I think that sign comes from this or that. Well, that's really folk etymology. And it's important to keep that separate from scientific etymology. For example, let's talk about the sign for America. People have various reasons for why that sign is what it is. And we've seen that those reasons have changed over the years. One very well-known example of this is seeing America as a melting pot. There were a lot of publications and books of it at that time. Here's a picture. There's a big bowl saying citizenship with lots of people in it, and there's a woman in an American flag, and she's stirring the pot, mingling all the people. She's using a big spoon to mix all the people together. So some people felt that the sign for America was symbolizing a melting pot. But I remember another folk etymology that was different. When I grew up, I remembered one explanation for that sign. People said it was to represent log cabins, because there used to be a lot of log cabins in America, and people moved from place to place, but log cabins could be built with wood logs, one on top of another, and those intertwined logs looked like the sign for America. Similar to the way rooftops, and many rooftops, have become the sign for city. And we think that maybe because European people came over here and they had never seen log cabins before, maybe that was their idea of America, so they signed America that way. But I've met a lot of other people who have other descriptions of the sign for America. Some people say it comes from rail fences. And sometimes people say, oh, look in the book here. There was a book by Watson in the 1870s, and I'll show you a picture of it that I got from this book. So you can see, we've had people talking about the sign for America coming from log cabin, coming from melting pot, and coming from rails. So you can see that people have various ideas of why that sign was created. People have so many ideas about this because nobody actually ever documented it so that people could look back at the history. The history's gone. So when the history is gone and there's no scientific evidence, people tend to create things. They make things up. They create stories and explanations to explain the unexplained. But people tend to look at the iconicity of signs. And they look around and they establish meaning based on what something looks like. Another person might argue that they saw the same sign before and it meant something else. And if a lot of people agree with one person's idea, maybe they'll accept that. I personally have gone through those 3 stages of believing the sign for America meant those 3 different things. And that's what folk etymology is. Now I'd like to focus on how we can establish guidelines to help improve our etymology and make it more scientific than it was in the past. There's an increasing literature now looking back at the history of deaf people and eradicating some of this folk etymology because people have made up so many things over the years that the actual history is gone. We do rely on folk etymology to some extent to see what people were talking about a sign at a particular time compared to another sign, how people used it or why they thought it was used, and we can see how signs change. It shows their function in the language. So we definitely consider folk etymology in our analysis, but what we call it is a reanalysis, because our analysis now is different from the analysis in the past. This folk etymology itself involves several cycles of reanalysis as people reanalyze what they think a sign means and where it came from. So in terms of creating guidelines to improve etymology, people in France, deaf people in France, have a sign language, and American people have a sign language. And Woodward did some comparative analyses and found a lot of similarities, what are called cognates, which means basically you make a list of words, you survey people from both languages, and you see which words are the same, and those are cognates. And Woodward said about 60% of those were cognates. If we look at the word keep and the ASL sign for it, we see this sign, and then in France they have a different sign. And it's a little bit hard to decide how similar they are, because they look a little bit similar, but they're different enough to be not quite the same. The way that we sign it here, we use a K hand shape, and people may think that that relates to the English word keep. But in France, theirs doesn't look like that. So speaking about how to improve the science of etymology and looking at history and how these signs change, we call it periodization. Supala and Clark are publishing about this right now. They are working on capturing folk etymologies from particular periods and then analyzing the folk etymologies from other periods and seeing how they've evolved over time. For example, some signs may be initialized, but with time, maybe we've lost the knowledge of the sign, or what English word it was connected to. Here's an example I'll show you. The sign for name. We use 2 fingers on each hand, name, but in the past they used a different sign, and I'll show you a film clip. This was EMG, and you can watch the clip to see what I'm talking about. See there? He was using only 1 finger on each hand. And we think that maybe that sign appeared because people would say, sign here on this line and sign your name. And so people might have thought of signing name as the left finger is a line and the right finger is a name. So we see that at that time period, EMG signed it that way. But then why do we sign it the way we do now? We can see 3 different periods in the way that people signed the sign name. And we can see how those have changed at certain times. What we see is that changes seem to happen less and less with time. That's semantic blanching. And you can see that these time periods are there and that they've gone through changes over time. And